an Egyptian slave, a pregnant fugitive, was the only one to name the God of Israel. Neither Abraham nor Moses dared. Her story begins in the desert. Genesis chapter 16 records an event unparalleled in all ancient biblical texts. Why was an Egyptian slave the only one to name the God of Israel? We will investigate the original Hebrew text to understand the desert encounter that redefined the theology of the patriarchs. A yellowed scroll of parchment reveals the lineage of the great founders of the Hebrew faith: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, men who raised stone altars and conversed with the divine under the Middle Eastern sky. They received promises, forged covenants, and founded a nation, but none of them dared to name the Creator. When Moses, centuries later, stood before the burning bush on Mount Horeb, he had to ask what the divinity was called. The sacred text is strict about the hierarchy of revelation. The prerogative of naming belongs to those with authority. In Eden, man names the animals. In antiquity, the sovereign names his vassals. And yet, the book of Genesis preserves a theological anomaly that challenges the entire patriarchal structure of the ancient world. A foreign woman, pregnant and fugitive, sat in the dust near a water spring, a slave who did not belong to the lineage of the promise. She not only witnesses a divine manifestation, she looks at the divinity and pronounces an unprecedented title, a Hebrew name that would be etched into the Torah forever. To understand the weight of that single word, we must retrace the path that led this Egyptian woman to the sands of that desert. The sands of the road to Shur hold the trace of a desperate escape. The narrative rewinds to Abraham's tent, the patriarch who had returned from a journey through Egypt. The book of Genesis in chapter 12 documents that he brought riches, cattle, silver, gold, and servants. Among these servants was a young Egyptian woman named Hagar. She was assigned as personal maidservant to Sarai, the patriarch's wife. The historical context of the ancient Near East is fundamental here. Clay tablets found in the ancient city of Nuzi, dating back to the 2nd millennium BC, reveal the marriage contracts of the era. If a wife was barren, it was her legal duty to provide a slave to her husband to bear an heir. The child born would belong to the principal wife. The Code of Hammurabi, contemporary to the patriarchs, details strict laws about this practice. Sarai, unable to have children and seeing time pass, resorted to this documented custom. She gave Hagar to Abraham. The slave became pregnant, and the Hebrew text of chapter 16 is surgical in describing the shift in the tent's dynamic. Verse 4 records that, upon realizing she was pregnant, Hagar began to look at her mistress with contempt. The tension became insustainable under the family's fabric roof. Sarai demanded justice from Abraham. The patriarch abdicated responsibility and returned authority to her mistress, saying the slave was in her hands to do as she saw fit. The Hebrew word used to describe what Sarai did next is ana, the exact same verb that the Bible would use centuries later to describe the brutal oppression of the Israelites in Egypt. The irony of the text is evident. Before Israel was enslaved in Egypt, an Egyptian woman was oppressed by the founders of Israel. Unable to endure the hardship, the young woman gathered what she could. She fled into the arid desert, walking aimlessly until she collapsed near a dark well. The road to Shur was an ancient caravan route connecting Canaan to Egypt, a deadly journey for a solitary woman without provisions or protection. However, at the edge of that water spring, surrounded by hot stones, the narrative breaks the pattern of Genesis. The text records that the angel of the Lord found her.
This is the first time in the entire Bible that this mysterious figure, the Malach Yahweh, makes a documented appearance. The angel doesn't appear to the clan leader. It doesn't manifest at the altar of Hebron. It descends into the desert, seeking the fugitive on the Egyptian route. And the first detail that academic commentators observe is in the greeting. The angel says, Hagar, servant of Sarai. In the ancient world, slaves were rarely called by name in official documents. They were property, numbers, instruments of labor. But the divine voice recognizes her by her identity and by her exact social condition. The angel asks two questions: where are you coming from and where are you going? A demand for reflection that echoes the question posed to Adam in the Garden of Eden. What if the first personal theophany in Genesis was not for the patriarch, but for the discarded foreigner? Hagar responds with dry honesty. I'm fleeing from Sarai, my mistress. She doesn't try to justify her fleet or ask for rescue. The angel's response is paradoxical. He orders her to return and submit to Sarai's authority, an instruction that seems to endorse the oppression from which she was fleeing. But immediately afterward, the messenger delivers an autonomous dynastic promise to Hagar. He declares that he will multiply her descendants in such a way that they cannot be counted. This is a moment of literary and theological rupture. Promises of innumerable descendants in the ancient Near East were given exclusively to kings and patriarchs, never to a woman, much less a slave, foreigner without a clan. The angel further prophesies about the son in her womb. He instructs Hagar to name him Ishmael, which in Hebrew means God hears. God heard the slave's affliction, and it is precisely this unexpected attention that provokes the reaction that would change the sacred text. The slave's lips move in the silence of that desert, marking the climax of chapter 16. She doesn't build a stone altar as Abraham used to. She doesn't offer an animal sacrifice. Instead, she uses language. Verse 13 documents Hagar's response to the divinity. The Hebrew text says, Ata el roi. The literal translation of this expression is, you are the God who sees me, or the God of vision. The grammar of ancient Hebrew reveals a fascinating detail. The word roi carries a first-person pronominal suffix. It's not just the God who sees the world from afar, it is the God who sees me. This is the exact moment that the paradox reaches its peak. An oppressed woman with no rights or homeland coins a theological title for the creator of the universe. And most impressively, the biblical text accepts the naming. The Genesis narrator validates Hagar's speech, incorporating the name El Roi into canonical revelation. To understand the magnitude of this, we need to look at the Egyptian culture from which the young woman came. In the pantheon of the Nile River, the gods were distant, focused on the pharaoh and the maintenance of cosmic order, Ma'at. A slave in Egypt was invisible to the gods. In Abraham's household, Hagar was merely a surrogate womb, invisible as a person with her own will. To be seen in the ancient mindset was not merely to be visually noticed. The gaze of a superior conferred existence, value, and legal protection. When Hagar says, "You are the God who sees me," she is declaring a revolutionary theological discovery. She found a divinity that is not confined to palaces and altars, but descends into the dust to see the discarded. She further adds an enigmatic phrase preserved in the Masoretic text, "Have I truly seen the one who sees me?" Rabbinic tradition has debated the exact meaning of this construction for centuries. Some scholars suggest physical astonishment at having survived a divine vision in the wilderness.
Others point to the wonder of realizing that God's presence extended to the most desolate edges of the known world. The implication of this discovery reverberates far beyond that well.
That stone well in the desert received a new name after the encounter, becoming known as Bir Lahai Roi. This translation of this geographical landmark is the well of the living one who sees me, a scar on the arid landscape testifying that revelation does not belong only to the tent owners. Why was an Egyptian slave the only one to name the God of Israel? Because the patriarchs knew the divinity through political alliances, promises of land, and military victories. They experienced El Shaddai, the Almighty God who subdued kings. But the fleeing slave needed a different face of the divine. She was the first to experience the intimacy of a God who tracks individual pain at the margins of society. The naming of El Roi was not an act of arrogance, but the precise recognition of an attribute unknown to the official religion of Canaan. The invisible woman gave a name to the God who sees what official history tries to erase. In our next episode, we will investigate Jephthah's daughter, the vow that cost a life. The stone altar in the mountains of Gilead still holds the silence of one of the darkest texts in the book of Judges, where a general's promise collided with a young woman's devotion.